sinners, and saints. Dust off those horns and halos. It's time for Alley After Dark.
Traditions. Some people might call them customs, but for the sake of argument, we're just going to say traditions. We all have them. They usually center around holidays, maybe birthdays or anniversaries. But here in the South, we had traditions that I think, looking back on them, are very unusual, uncommon, maybe even weird in some people's eyes. I have a feeling that some of these traditions that I'm going to talk about may still be happening in places, and they may happen in other parts of the country or the world and may not seem so unusual or weird or uncommon. As I was growing up and experiencing certain things, it sometimes felt unusual or weird, but I guess you just get used to it. It's like what everybody's doing. It's the common practice of the community where you live. And so if they think it's not unusual, then maybe I shouldn't think it's so unusual. So let's take a trip back in time and talk about some of the unusual traditions that we had in the South, in the town where I lived. When I was about 7 years old, my uncle Charles was killed in a car accident. And of course, the death of any person is tragic, but when it's a younger person, that really is more tragic. So he was in his early 20s when he was killed. Upon his death, usually someone at a funeral home comes to the hospital and takes the body and prepares it for a showing, and you gather at the funeral home, and there's that horrible music, and there are people everywhere offering their condolences and expressing their sadness. But when Uncle Charles died, he was brought home. Now, what I mean by that is that he was taken to the funeral home, they prepared his body, he was placed in a casket, and they brought the casket with him in it to my grandmother's house. His body lay there in that casket for 3 days and nights in the living room of my grandmother's home. And the whole community would be there. They would bring food. The yard was full of people. The house was full of people. And it was just a common thing. When somebody died, they were brought home. I wonder, looking back on it, was it also less expensive than like renting out the room at the funeral home? Either way, that was what happened. And in those years, a lot of people practiced that tradition. Their loved one was brought back to their home where they lived, and they were presented to the whole community. And also, it was tradition for at least one person, a member of the family, to quote unquote stay up with the body. And what that meant is that there was somebody day and night staying in the house, in the room with the person who had died. I can remember my mother telling me that they were planning to stay all night on one of those nights. I was just like 7 years old, and my brother was like 2, and it just seemed like, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? We don't get to sleep or anything. But fortunately for me and my brother, my mother changed her mind, and we went home and went to bed and came back the next morning. So that was a common practice at the time. But as we moved forward in time, it started happening less and less. People were utilizing the funeral home for the whole process. I can remember for many years not having that experience. And then it came up when Miss Jenkins passed away that she was brought home. And that was probably around 1990, I guess. And it had been so long since anyone had done that it felt kind of weird. I mean, it felt even more unusual. It just felt like an old tradition that we didn't want to bring back. But that's what the family wanted, and so be it. But you just had so many people at the house that it was actually uncomfortable. There was not much room for people to squeeze in and out. The side yard and the backyard were full of people. It didn't last as long as it did with my Uncle Charles, where it was a full 3 days and nights. Trust me when I say those become the longest days and nights of your life. It's hard to put it in words other than the sorrow you feel, and it just lingers. It lingers on and on throughout that time frame to where there's no disconnect. I can't explain that in a way that makes sense, but having him in the house, it led to that belief from my grandmother that at one point she thought maybe he was haunting the house. And there were always whispers, well, if she hadn't brought him back home and had his services at the funeral home, this might not have happened. The haunting, as they believed. Take that for what you will. I can remember also with Miss Jenkins, that was the last time that I can recall anybody doing it. Now, I remember reading in the papers at some point in the recent past that people were actually bringing their dead loved ones home and actually setting them up in a chair or on the couch or whatever and propping them up with a cigarette and a soda or their sunglasses. I just gotta say, that's a bit morbid in my opinion. I can understand it, but even for me, as open-minded as I am, I just don't think I could go that far. One of my best friends, Eddie, when he passed away, he was buried in a University of Tennessee casket in the color of orange, which is what he loved. He loved football and basketball. He loved all the sports, and he loved the University of Tennessee Vols. He loved all the teams. It was a fitting last send-off for him to be buried in a UT Vols casket. So that's a tradition I could get behind. I mean, it just worked, and it brought, even through the heartbreak and the sadness, seeing him in that casket, it did bring some happiness because it just reminded everybody how much he loved sports, especially UT football. That's a big difference than bringing him home in his casket and having him in the living room for everyone to visit. Don't you think? Am I in the wrong here for thinking that was an unusual practice? And with traditions, I think at that time there was probably pressure to bring a loved one home for their last time on this earth. That all comes from this worry about what your neighbors think about you. What are they going to say about you if you don't follow a tradition that everybody else does? Now, what would happen if it was a person who didn't have a home of their own? Maybe they rented an apartment or didn't own a place big enough. Well, they would have to use the services of a funeral home or the church. That would be almost like a scarlet letter as well. It would be like, oh my goodness, that poor person didn't even have a home to face their last rites. It's always been a thing about the South, and it may be everywhere else too, but there were always worries about what your neighbors thought about you and how they would treat you if you didn't practice a tradition that everybody else did. I mean, I can remember that cremation was almost frowned upon. And now, though, in this time, cremation is a logical option because of the expense. It is very expensive to be dead, to bury somebody, to have the casket and the process of preparing the body and the burial. It costs thousands upon thousands of dollars. So cremation is by far cheaper than a traditional burial. A second custom or tradition during funerals, a lot of people took pictures of themselves standing next to the casket and at the cemetery, at the grave. I can go through my mom's photo album, and she has copies of pictures at my father's father, my grandfather, who I never met, his funeral. They believed it was a way to record history. These people were gathered at the funeral. I hope it wasn't designed to shame people if you didn't appear in a picture, because I really wouldn't want to appear in a picture at a funeral because I'm usually a basket case. And I can remember when my grandmother passed away that one of my aunt's husbands was at the funeral home and he was taking pictures. And I distinctly remember him taking a picture of my grandmother's husband leaning over, looking at her in the casket. I was just disgusted by that. But it's more because I could not stand the man. He was, well, that's a totally different story. And it was just something to see these pictures. And I can see the look on my dad's face. He was the youngest of the family. And the expression on his face, you could tell that he was heartbroken. It does tell a story, I suppose, but it just seems like not the right time to be taking pictures. But it is true that usually a funeral is the only time that an entire family gets together. I mean, that's true now as it was then. So that's just the fact of life. And I know it does happen today, but back in the day, if someone was in the hospital, there was always a member of the family there at the hospital with them, no matter how long it was. And I know that there's people that, yes, that I love so much that I would be there as much as I can, but life doesn't allow that. Most of us have to work. We have to bring home money. We have to make a living. We have to survive. And that means sometimes not being at the hospital with somebody you love. Oh my gosh, I can remember my grandmother with her heart problems. She spent, I think it was like 40 days in the hospital in a different town. So it wasn't like it was a hospital just 20 miles away. We're talking about a hospital that was 70 miles away. And my mom, her sisters, some of them, not all of them, somebody would always be there at the hospital, even if she was in intensive care, and you could only see the person for a few minutes every hour or two. I kept thinking, the only way you can do that is if you are maybe a housewife who doesn't have a job outside the home where you have to work to get paid, and you can let the rest of the family take care of the house. It just doesn't seem very viable now, but you would be judged harshly if you did not spend time at the hospital with a loved one. People would trash you, gossip about you if you weren't there. And it didn't matter if you were an adult or if you were a teenager. People would basically sort of try to brag about themselves spending so much time at the hospital with them and say, well, this person hasn't been here in 5 days or 10 days. I guess I'm sounding a little bitter, but it's because I experienced that myself. And if it was to happen today, where a loved one is in the hospital, how could I do it? I have to work. Most of us have to work. So how can you judge somebody for something that is out of their control? Nobody wants a loved one to be sick, but it doesn't mean that we can spend our whole time there. Of course, if it's end of life and the person is on the verge of going, we're all going to be there if they want us to be there. I know that's part of the reasoning behind it. And it was explained really well on the movie Steel Magnolias. When Malin refused to leave Shelby's bedside, she said, well, what if she wakes up for a couple of minutes and I'm not here? She was hoping for that chance to talk one more time to her daughter. I get that. Her daughter was in an irreversible coma, too. That's a little bit different than other situations. But yes, you wouldn't want a person to die alone. Being with someone who's dying is hard enough, too. So all kudos to people who can do that, but I don't think people who have to work should be judged harshly for not being at a bedside 24/7. If that makes people mad, feel free to punch me in the face when I see you. Y'all might find this funny, but what inspired me to talk about this subject was someone who is from the South, very thick Southern accent. We had just got through having lunch, and she said that she was foundered.
I'm sorry, what?
Did you hear that? Foundered. I said, did you say floundered? No, foundered. I am foundered. Well, we had to look it up. It's Southern slang for being stuffed after eating a big meal. We just all chuckled because she was surprised that most of us had not heard that word. I even asked my mother, and she said, no, I've never heard that word ever used before. And it's a funny thing how the Southern dialect comes up with words that usually are a derivative of an actual word used maybe in Old England or Europe or somewhere. And I got to thinking about that too. And it's like we used language decades ago that we really don't use now. Like, for example, a grocery bag. We just call it a bag, right? That's what I call it. But back when I was young, living back home in a small town in the South, in Tennessee, we called a grocery bag a poke. You heard me right, poke, P-O-K-E. And it's actually a word that's derived from the word pocket, which would make sense. You know, pockets hold change, keys, and so on. So a poke is a type of pocket. Fun times, right? And one of the things that always struck me as interesting is when I'm working on my family tree, my genealogy, and I'm looking at old records, especially census records. And I was looking at one from my grandmother's sister, whose name is Ada, A-D-A, Ada. But people in these parts didn't pronounce her name that way. She wasn't called Ada by most people. She was actually called Ader, Ader. And it got really hard to track my great aunt Ada, because in census records, the census taker would have spelled it A-D-E-R, Ader, because that's how we heard it. So when you would ask someone who pronounces words like that, well, I mean, for example, mater for tomato or tater for potato, the part seems to be a cultural norm of our language in the South. It's not used as much now as it was then, but when you think about that, you would ask her, like if somebody said, that's Ader, and you would say, how do you spell that? And they would say A-D-A. And you would go like, oh, Ada. And they would look at you so funny, like, no, that's Ader. It's so funny when I think about the language. Being a farm boy myself, there was cows and we had horses and pigs and chickens and ducks and all kinds of creatures in the barnyard. And you didn't go and feed the hogs, the pigs. You went and slopped the hogs. I remember this time my dad brought in a watermelon. He was going to slice it up and we were going to have it. But he always had this habit of taking a bite of it before he finished cutting it. Well, he took a bite and he goes, oh no, this is sour. And I was like, what? It's sour. It's like, sour? You mean sour? Maybe we can put sugar on it. He goes, no, sour. And he meant spoiled. It's just one of those turns of phrases. And yes, the way you would say sour, you made it just one syllable, sour. I can still remember that as plain as day. And that's been quite a few years ago. I was probably 5 or 6 when that happened. But they had trouble convincing me because I didn't understand that they didn't mean that it was really sour, but that it was spoiled. And I kept insisting that if we put sugar on it, it should be okay. But then when I realized they meant that it was spoiled, then I understood. So there's you a few tidbits of historical knowledge about the Old South. And there you have it, sinners and saints. Another episode of Alan After Dark in the books. And I just want to thank you for hanging out with me, talking about something that we've not really talked about before. And I've had a pretty good time. I hope you have too. You know, it's pretty much a shock that I haven't even brought up sex once in this episode. So anyway, we'll be talking about sex next week, I'm sure. And until then, remember, take life by the balls and be real. We'll see you soon.
Yeehaw!